The Specter of Communism in Hawaii, 1947 to 1953. Chapter 6, The Ideals of Democracy. When the Reinecke hearing began, it started with a bang. The territorial government flew in one of the nation's leading anti-communist figures, Louis Budence. Budence had held several key positions as a member of the Communist Party, including managing editor of the Daily Worker from 1941 until his departure from the party in October 1945. Herbert Packer, in his book Ex-Communist Witness, noted that Budence was the leading interpreter of communist theology in the many proceedings in which he has testified, partly because he has been so prolific a source of accusations against persons prominent in American political and intellectual life. Budence had no personal experience with the Communist Party in Hawaii, but was in Honolulu to demonstrate the general proposition that no communist could possess the ideals of democracy. The day before he testified before the Territorial Commissioners of Public Instruction, Louis Budence had appeared before a special United States Senate investigating subcommittee, chaired by Homer Ferguson, Republican from Michigan, which was investigating alleged World War II espionage activities of American communists who held sensitive government positions. Budence's arrival in Honolulu produced a somewhat misleading headline in the Honolulu Advertiser, Hawaii Red Target, Budence. The most dramatic statement the reporter could get from his interview with Budence concerning communism in Hawaii was Budence's comment that the infiltration effort in Hawaii met with some success, but it was not as successful as the party leaders hoped. When it came to the purposes of the Communist Party in America, Budence was more forceful. The whole reason for the existence of the Communist Party in America is the overthrow by force of the Republic, when Moscow wants that to be done. Before Budence took the witness chair, there were the inevitable legal motions and challenges from defense counsel Richard Gladstein, a colorful labor lawyer from San Francisco, and from the Reinecke's local counsel, Harriet Bauslag and Meyer Simmons. The most interesting challenges were those leveled at the commissioners themselves. A review of these challenges will serve as an introduction to those who sat in judgment of John and Aiko Reinecke. The first challenge was leveled against Mrs. Ruth E. Black, the wife of E. E. Black, the president of the Honolulu Gas Company, director of Castle and Cook, secretary of Hawaiian Gas Products, Inc., and president of E. E. Black, Limited. Contractors. Mrs. Black was vice president of E. E. Black, Limited. Meyer Simmons charged that Mrs. Black should be disqualified because her business background would necessarily make her biased, because she had openly displayed an anti-labor bias during the Pineapple Strike of 1947, during which both John and Aiko Reinecke had walked the picket lines in support of the strikers, because Mrs. Black was one of the prime movers in the vocally anti-communist group We the Women, and had addressed that organization on the subject of the fifth freedom, the freedom to hold a job without being obliged to join a union, and because on April 25, 1947, Mrs. Black had entered John Reinecke's classroom at Farrington High School and had openly challenged his method of presenting an outline of the Taft-Hartley Act to his social studies class. Next, Wayne Ellis was challenged because his business and social connections on Kauai were mostly with plantation owners and management, and because he had denied the Reineckes, illegally the defense continued, the right to use a schoolroom in March 1948 for a public and lawful meeting on Kauai. The third challenge was against E. Stanley Elmore of Maui. Elmore was ill at the time and subsequently removed himself from the panel of commissioners hearing the Reinecke case. John A. Owens, the territorial representative of the AFL, was Simmons' next target. Simmons pointed out that there was a well-known split within the AFL, with the two factions being led by Owens and Art Rutledge. Not only had John Reinecke worked for the ILWU, but he had also helped Rutledge on many occasions, which would make him double damned in the eyes of Owens, Simmons contended. Owens had, furthermore, openly opposed the ILWU's 1946 sugar strike and, during the 1947 Pineapple Strike, had sought to raid the ranks of the ILWU. Owens had testified at a statehood hearing on January 8, 1948, that the ILWU was a communist-dominated union. He had made the same charges in a forum held by the Women. He had guided Amos Ignacio's Union of Hawaiian Workers into the AFL, and he had been a wholehearted supporter of Governor Steinbach's anti-communist program. Finally, Simmons turned his attention to the chairman of the Commissioners of Public Instruction, Edward N. Silva. In March 1948, Silva had been appointed a deputy attorney general for the territory of Hawaii. His associates were presenting the territory's case against the Reinecke's. He had helped prosecute the case known as People v. Ackerman, a case in which John Reinecke had been deeply involved in preparing a challenge concerning the representative character, or lack thereof, of the grand jury that had brought the original indictments. The Reinecke's see no difference between Mr. Silva sitting as chairman of the commission and if he was to go down and sit at Mr. Ackerman's. The Attorney General table and one of the deputies were to take Mr. Silva's place, Simmons contended. Commissioners Gu and Falconer were not specifically challenged, but the board as a whole was challenged for being anti-union. This was because they were subject to appointment and removal by Governor Steinbach, and they demonstrated their closed minds on union issues by approving Principles Circular 943 in March 1948. The commissioners determined that they were fit to hear the charges against the Reineckies, which was not surprising. Gladstein sought to have Superintendent W. Harold Loper as the first witness, but Silva denied the request. Gladstein then threatened to demand separate hearings for John and Aco, which Silva also declined. Attorney General Ackerman offered a plan to make the hearings go smoothly, where each side could question their own witnesses without objections until that witness's testimony was completed. Gladstein nearly exploded at the suggestion, claiming it was an effort to gag the teachers and their attorneys. Silva ultimately ruled in favor of the defense. Louis Francis Budence was employed as an assistant professor of economics at Fordham University and had previously been on the faculty at Notre Dame University. He had renounced his membership in the Communist Party and converted back to his childhood faith, Roman Catholicism. Budence was a prized government witness, an expert on the nature and purposes of communist conspiracy. On August 5, 1948, Louis Budence launched into an account of the nature and purposes of the Communist Party in the United States for the benefit of the Commissioners of Public Instruction of the Territory of Hawaii. His testimony bore no direct relationship to the Reineckies and was filled with hearsay evidence. Attorney Gladstein objected to both aspects of Budence's testimony, especially the latter, knowing it was a lost cause. Silva dismissed Gladstein's objections regarding hearsay testimony in a casual manner. In the taking of testimony, both by the Attorney General and the defense, hearsay, and even hearsay upon hearsay, will be allowed. This is a hearing before this board. The technical rules of evidence do not strictly apply. It would not serve a useful purpose to go into great detail about Budence's testimony since it did not directly relate to either the Reineckies or the Territory of Hawaii. Its primary purpose was to paint a picture of the Communist Party in the most conspiratorial light. The exchanges between Budence and Gladstein were bitter and often personal. Hamilton Ware, a writer for the Honolulu Advertiser, commented on the atmosphere in the courtroom where the hearing was held and said, "At times, the carnival sideshow aspect of the hearing is so pronounced that a witness walking in for the first time would not realize the seriousness of the issues before the commission." From the line of questioning by Reinecki counsel, led by Richard Gladstein, it was evident that their intention was to smear Mr. Budence with everything that could be found. Attorney Gladstein accused the witness of framing his answers as speeches. Territorial Attorney General W.D. Ackerman, Jr., accused Mr. Gladstein of framing his questions as speeches. The average spectator would agree with both accusations. At one point, Budence became angry at Gladstein's pronunciation of his name, to which Gladstein responded, "I thought that it was more in harmony with the nature of your testimony to put the accent on the boo, and that's why I have been using it." The most telling aspects of Budence's testimony were in exchanges such as the following between the ex-communist and Silva. Silva, in light of your experience as a communist up to the fall of 1945, and from what you know today, and speaking just for yourself, and if you were still a communist, what would be your attitude in the event of a shooting war? Budence, as a communist, I'd do whatever the Soviet Union wanted done, as communists in the Communist Party have always done under orders. I would, therefore, do anything that would advance the victory of Soviet Russia over the United States. This was damning testimony from a man who should know. The willingness of Americans, at this time, to give special consideration to the testimony of ex-communists was one of the special features of what has come to be known as the McCarthy era. Herbert Packer, who studied all of the important ex-communist witnesses, indicated that they tended to be unstable people with a tendency to go to extremes. They were true believers by personality type. This may account for some of the unshakable assurance with which they testified. Budence was a master. He had a celebrity quality which helped to reinforce the predispositions carried into the hearing by the commissioners. When asked about teachers, Budence pointed out that a communist teacher might well be instructed to maintain a low profile. The Communist Party might consider this teacher, Budence said without any specific reference to the suspended Reineckies, more valuable as a member of the community operating in certain organizations, and not wanting that teacher to expose himself. Budence made the point for the record that every member of the Communist Party was a potential espionage agent. Gladstein's cross-examination of Budence was very personal at many points. He tried to establish a monetary reason for the witness's new profession as an ex-communist. Budence remained cool, even when Gladstein pointed out that the witness was not only collecting witness fees from the government, but getting invaluable free publicity for his recently published book. This is my story. Footnote, it was not established at the Reinecke hearing just how much profit there was in being a professional ex-communist. But in 1953 Budens boasted of having earned $70,000 for his ex-communist activities in that year alone. Footnote end. Gladstein made even less headway when he went into Budens's married life, seeking to depict him as a bigamist, adulterer, and family deserter. This line of questioning actually became counterproductive when Budens pointed out that he had done these horrible things while under the influence of communism. Gladstein finished his cross-examination of Budens with a historical excursion, which would show a reader of the 1970s that the new left is now saying very much the same thing the old left was saying 25 years ago. Gladstein's history lessons, interesting though they may have been, seem to have made no impression on the commissioners. Budens, his 3-day stint in Honolulu completed, hurried back to Washington, D.C., where the more important business of the nation demanded his attention. The territory's second witness was W. Harold Loper, Superintendent of Public Instruction. Loper, with the Department of Public Instruction since 1921, had held his present position since 1946 when he replaced Orrin Long, future governor of the Territory of Hawaii. Loper opened his testimony with an account of a meeting with John Reinecke and Walton Gordon, his principal at Farrington High School in April 1947. The meeting had come hard on the heels of the release of the documents associated with the Roberts Report, and Loper asked Reinecke point blank if he were a communist. Loper recalled that Reinecke hedged on that question but was firmly negative when asked if he advocated the overthrow of the government by force and violence. When Loper asked Reinecke if he would be willing to come before the Commissioners of Public Instruction to express himself on the matters they had discussed, Reinecke is reported as having demurred. Loper then reviewed the charges against the Reineckes. Deputy Attorney General Griffith posed the big question, have you formed an opinion, Dr. Loper, as to whether a member of the Communist Party is possessed of the ideals of democracy? Loper replied, well, it's my opinion that it would be impossible for a person of any considerable education to believe in the principles and practices of the Communist Party as we see it operating in the world today, and at the same time be possessed of the ideals of democracy. Griffith then asked, would your answer be any different if it were shown that there was an absence of any obvious act of the teaching of principles of communism in the public schools? Loper replied, I think not. That is, I think, even apart from teaching communism in the schools, that such a teacher would be unfit for service in the public schools. If we may assume that acceptance of the principles of communism means loyalty to the party line and accepting dictatorship from above as to what a party member must do at any time, even though such a teacher had not, up to the present time, taught communism, advocated the practices and principles of communism to the boys and girls in the school, such a teacher might at any time be ordered to do so by the authorities, or the dictator in the Communist Party. I have another reason for my opinion on that point, and it is this, that a teacher of children influences their lives almost as much by what the teacher is as by what he says. To have a known communist continue as a public school teacher would be, in effect, saying to the boys and girls and to the parents of those children, it is quite all right for you to join the Communist Party, too. And there, in brief, was the heart of the Territory's case against John and Aiko Reinecke. In cross-examination, Gladstein hammered away at the idea of guilt by association. Quoting Justice Murphy, the doctrine of personal guilt is one of the most fundamental principles of our jurisprudence. It partakes of the very essence of the concepts of freedom and due process of law. It prevents persecution of the innocent for the beliefs and actions of others. He also quoted Charles Evans Hughes, it is the essence of the institutions of liberty that it be recognized that guilt is personal and cannot be attributed to the holding of opinion or to mere intent in the absence of overt acts. Loper seemed, in his response, to agree with Gladstein in theory, if not in practice. Gladstein questioned Loper extensively about his circular to the principals and the implied threat to Hawaii's teachers contained in that document. Loper took the position that a teacher's rights were not as broad as others, citing the fact that in Hawaii, a teacher could not hold a political office or hold a seat as a delegate to a political convention. In a more philosophical discussion, it became apparent that Loper equated the terms capitalism and democracy. This confusion of economic and political terms was something characteristic of most proceedings concerning the issue of communism. Loper conceded that capitalism could exist under a dictatorship, with Hitler's Germany being posed as the prime example. But he would not concede that communism could be democratic and defended the right of the Department of Public Instruction to determine the character of the Communist Party in Hawaii. When the line of questioning turned to John Reinecke, Gladstein asked a very important question. Has there ever been any evidence of Dr. Reinecke's ever teaching anything that you call doctrines or principles of the Communist Party in the classes? Loper's response, there is no evidence that has been brought to my attention. Gladstein, seeking to discover just how much controversial discussion Loper was willing to tolerate, asked the superintendent about a hypothetical debate between William Z. Foster and Governor Steinbach on communism versus capitalism. Do you think, Doctor, Gladstein asked, that such a debate would be in the interest of the people or against the interest of the people? Loper responded, I think that such a debate would certainly draw a big crowd. Gladstein continued his cross-examination, setting a trap for Loper. He engaged in a very close inspection of the preamble of the Constitution of the Communist Party, 1945. Ackerman, growing restive, told Gladstein the territory would concede that the document was quite innocuous. Gladstein rejoined that there was nothing innocuous about the document but that he would continue anyway. When he concluded reading the preamble, he asked Loper if there was anything he had read that was inconsistent with the ideals of democracy. Loper said no, not on the face of it. Then he fell into a trap. Loper, there is a place in the Bible that says, by their works ye shall know them. So I would take what you are reading here as a statement that looks fine and supplement it by other information and evidence as to what they actually believe by what they do. Gladstein, I am not opposed to that. In fact, I have been insistent that what we judge people by is their conduct and not what they believe, Doctor. The preceding exchange notwithstanding, the Commissioners of Public Instruction continued to hear a case against the Reinekis which was based totally upon their alleged beliefs. No instance of classroom misconduct was ever charged by the territory. The territory's third witness was Akiro Izuka. Public reaction to Izuka's testimony was mixed. The ILWU was obviously not impressed. That's the same old stuff from the same old source, Robert McElrath barked. Izuka was thoroughly exposed at the ILWU Hilo conference last January. All his charges have been rejected. Honolulu Advertiser writer Hamilton Ware was more sympathetic. Exceptionally interesting is the similarity of thought processes which led him first to embrace the communist philosophy, and then caused him to reject it at some personal risk. In both cases he was motivated by a desire to help the cause of the ordinary man. When he found out he was being fooled, he got out. This generous interpretation of Izuka's motivations is possible, but it is also possible to make the assumption that neither side was above fooling Izuka or using him for their own purposes, and that he was only too willing to be used in exchange for a moment in the limelight and a sense of belonging. However transient that might be, the testimony of Izuka on direct examination was essentially the same as the truth about communism in Hawaii, with some augmentations to emphasize the participation of John and Eiko Reineki in the activities of the Communist Party in Hawaii. The most dramatic addition was a story of buried communist literature which fell into the hands of U.S. military intelligence during World War II. At the outset of the war, members of the Communist Party were ordered to maintain a low profile and to destroy any literature in their possession which might link them with the party. Rather than destroy the literature in their possession, Peter and Alice Hyan decided to bury a box of books in a field on some land they were leasing near Cocoa Head. The Hyan family subsequently moved, leaving the books behind. Some of the buried books belonged to John Reineki and bore his name. Izuka was drawn into the affair when he was called to a meeting at the home of Robert McElrath on Sunday, May 30, 1943. Also in attendance besides Izuka and Robert McElrath were A.Q. McElrath, Alice Hyan, and Jack Komodo. Izuka was told that the new tenants of the former Hyan leasehold at Cocoa Head had called to say that they had discovered a box of buried books while plowing. The new tenants asked the Hyans to come pick them up. What the group at the McElrath house did not know was that the new tenants had called military intelligence before calling the Hyans, and that a trap had been set. When Izuka, Komodo, and Alice Hyan went to dig up the books, they were arrested and detained by military intelligence for several hours. The three were released at 10:30 p.m. that evening, and nothing more was ever said about the matter by the authorities. But the story, revealed 5 years later in Izuka's testimony, smacked of communist intrigue and the press gave it special attention. Izuka added to the story's newsworthiness when he told how, after he and Komodo were released by military intelligence, they went to Jack Hall's house where Hall just raised hell with Komodo and myself. Izuka also indicated in his testimony that John Reineki had taken part in the burying of the books, a charge which Reineki was later to deny vehemently when he took the stand. The territory called 3 witnesses to corroborate Izuka's testimony on the buried books. Charles Gilliland of Hawaiian Trust Company was called to give testimony showing that the Hyan family had, indeed, leased the property in question. Everett Afuk, one of the arresting officers who had subsequently joined the Territorial Attorney General's office as an investigator, verified Izuka's story about the arrest and told how it had been planned. Finally, Elaine Young, daughter of the man who then held the lease on the property in question, testified that she had seen Eiko Reineki and Alice Hyan looking about the premises, presumably for the spot where the books were buried, a couple of weeks before the arrest. Miss Young also corroborated Afuk's testimony on how Izuka, Komodo, and Alice Hyan had been set up for the arrest. The rest of Izuka's direct examination was rather dull. long and involved descriptions of organizations and procedures, an extensive list of names, few of which were new, and a largely self-serving description of his departure from the Communist Party comprised the remainder of Iizuka's testimony for the territory. Sandwiched between Iizuka's direct testimony and his cross-examination, the territory's last witness was presented. He was Dr. K.C. Liebrich, acting president of the University of Hawaii. Liebrich, whose academic specialization was political science, argued with attorney Gladstein about Jefferson and Lincoln and their interpretations of the right to revolution. But when the defense counsel asked Liebrich whether it were possible for socialism to exist in a democratic society, the professor begged off, saying you are going way aside from political science when you take that line. Just how such a question fell outside the scope of political science, Liebrich did not say. Liebrich's testimony concluded. The main event began, the cross-examination of Akira Iizuka. It was not an equal match. Gladstein was urbane, sophisticated, and extremely articulate. Iizuka was ill at ease and inarticulate, at times to the point of incoherence. Iizuka's testimony was living proof that somebody else had prepared the prose if not the substance of his now famous pamphlet. The following dialogue gives some of the feeling of the exchange between Gladstein and Iizuka. Gladstein, during the last 45 minutes, not last year, not 10 years ago, but within the last hour this morning, at one point you have said here under oath in the record that while you were in the Communist Party, neither did you believe in force and violence, nor did you regard the Communist Party as believing in force and violence. You gave that answer at one time. Later, you gave the answer here today that when you gave such answers, similar answers, on your application for a job to the army, you were telling a lie. Now those are two opposite statements. They cannot both be true. I want you to say here and now which time you were testifying falsely under oath this morning. The time that you said you've never believed in force or violence, or the time that you said you were lying when you said no on that very question in the army application blank. Iizuka, I can't understand the question. It's confusing me. Gladstein, after once again reviewing Iizuka's earlier testimony, please. Now, that's your testimony. Now those two are just opposite. I want you to tell me which is correct. Which one is right and which one's wrong. Iizuka, I didn't say those things. Gladstein, what's that? Say that loud. You say you didn't say those things. Why, there are 500 people in the room that heard you say those things. Iizuka, I cannot understand. Gladstein, are you confused, Mr. Iizuka? Iizuka, you're confusing me plenty. Really confused. Gladstein, you know, there's an old saying, confusion of the mind comes from corruption of the heart. At times, Iizuka broke out in giddy, nervous laughter. One of the more humorous, if pathetic, moments of the hearing took place when Gladstein asked Iizuka why he would not look at him while he was attempting to interrogate him. It turned out that Deputy Attorney General Blatt instructed Iizuka not to look into Gladstein's eyes in order to avoid their hypnotic effect. Iizuka was caught in a number of minor discrepancies in his testimony. He said none of his family knew of his having been a member of the Communist Party until his pamphlet was released, only to admit later that he had brought his own brother, Kane, into the party in 1938. He characterized a PAC meeting in Hilo as a Communist Party meeting, though one of those in attendance was Sam Stevens, a foreman at Mutual Telephone Company, whom he admitted was not a communist. He placed John Rienecke at a Communist Party meeting at a time when Rienecke could prove he was not even in the territory. He testified that John and Aiko were on Kauai during the 1946 sugar strike, when only Aiko was there in fact. Such errors were undoubtedly damaging to Iizuka's credibility, but the overwhelming bulk of his testimony worked in his favor, as did the sympathy many felt for this simple man who was being so brutally browbeaten by the carpetbagger attorney from San Francisco. One other point was also in Iizuka's favor, and that was the fact that the majority of what he said was true. Perhaps the manner in which it was characterized was false and the conclusions derived from his testimony were unjustified. But there was a Communist Party in Hawaii, and Iizuka had been a member of it, as were most of those he named as members, including, at least, John Rienecke, and that was what the hearing was all about. Gladstein's fruitless probing of the relationship between Iizuka and Ed Berman was interesting, but essentially superfluous. His unsuccessful efforts to get Iizuka to talk about who wrote the truth about communism in Hawaii can be similarly characterized. In the final analysis, Gladstein could only attack Iizuka himself. Gladstein, Mr. Iizuka, isn't it a fact that the reason or one of the reasons that you have been giving the kind of testimony you have given here is that you hate men like Jack Hall, Jack Kawano, McElrath? Isn't that right? Iizuka, I don't hate them individually. The only thing I don't like is the communist discipline, what the Communist Party says, what the Communist Party thinks. By the end of his nearly 5 days of cross-examination, Iizuka was in the mood to take some shots of his own. He implied that a part of the deal between Jack Hall and Joe Farrington in 1946 involved Hall's alleged penchant for alcohol. Iizuka, Jack likes his drinks. Gladstein, wait a minute. Jack Hall was in favor of supporting Mr. Farrington because he likes to have a drink. Is that your testimony? Is that your testimony? Izuka, that's one part. Maybe the Star Bulletin has something to do. Finally, Izuka got his chance to strike out at Gladstein. Izuka was concerned about something the attorney had said about him which was printed in the paper. It produced this rather humorous exchange. Gladstein, what did I say about you? Izuka, I think you said something. Demise. Gladstein, do you know what the word demise is? Laughter. Izuka, I don't know, and another thing followed up saying that I'm one of the biggest liars in what you say. Gladstein, that it has been my good fortune to meet. Izuka, I would like to make one good remark against you too, just so that we'll be even. Laughter. Gladstein, go ahead, make a speech. Izuka, I was going to tell you this, that you are one of the racketeering, professional liars defending the commis in the territory. Now, we're even. Laughter. Gladstein, you want to say more. Izuka, that's all. That's all. Gladstein, that's all you want to say. Just so you won't feel bad, do you want to know what the word demise means? Izuka, I don't know. Gladstein, well, it simply means we'll be through very shortly, and I'll give you the pleasure of leaving the witness stand. Now what I was saying was that the process of revealing the truth and peeling all the things that you wrapped yourself in to give the impressions that you tried to give in your direct examination, that process was taking place, and that by the time we finished with you in cross-examination, Mr. Izuka, the record of this case would stamp with unquestionable permanence the fact that the things in your pamphlet and the things you have said on direct examination were not true, and that the real reasons why you have been acting the way you have, the motives behind your conduct, will have come out so that people can pass on whether or not you are the savior of the rank and file in this territory or whether you are one of its worst enemies. Izuka, the meaning is a long meaning. First time I heard that demise had a long meaning like that. Laughter. Moments later, Izuka left the witness stand, and Richard Gladstein announced that he would have to withdraw from the case to meet an ILWU obligation in San Francisco. But before he left, he made a motion to dismiss the charges against John and Eiko Rieneki, offering a definition of loyalty and Americanism taken from Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. You see, my kind of loyalty is loyalty to one's country, not to its institutions or office holders. The country is the real thing, the substantial thing, the eternal thing. It is the thing to watch over and care for and be loyal to. Institutions are extraneous. They are its mere clothing, and clothing can wear out, become ragged, cease to be comfortable, cease to protect the body from winter, disease and death. To be loyal to rags, to shout for rags, to worship rags, to die for rags, that is the loyalty of unreason. I was from Connecticut, whose constitution declares that all political power is inherent in the people, and all free governments are founded on their authority and instituted for their benefit, and they have at all times an undeniable and indefeasible right to alter their form of government in such a manner as they may think expedient. Under that gospel, the citizen who thinks he sees that the Commonwealth's political clothes are worn out, and yet holds his peace and does not agitate for a new suit, is disloyal, he is a traitor. That he may be the only one who thinks he sees this decay does not excuse him. It is his duty to agitate anyway, and it is the duty of others to vote him down if they do not see the matter as he does. It was a moving, and perhaps apt, statement, but it reminds the author somewhat of the satirist Tom Lehrer's analysis of the Spanish Civil War. Lehrer observed that Franco may have won the war, but the Loyalists had all the best songs.